Alrighty, we are going to go ahead and get started. Um, Good evening, everyone. My name is Annabella Maria Galang, and we are all here to celebrate Women's History Month with the Steminist Movement, and we are deeply honored to welcome with us today Dr. Gadir. Azza Gadir, she is an absolutely incredible woman in STEM who studied microbiology and immunology. She got her PhD at Harvard. She's also worked in a number of different entrepreneurial environments, which we'll hear all about. And we are so excited to have her with us today. Dr. Gadir, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Although I have to correct one thing, I did my postdoc at Harvard, but it's
I'm so
okay. I just
sorry.
wanted to, yeah.
Of course,
But thank
yes.
you so
Well,
much. I'm very excited to speak to you today.
wonderful. We'll get to hear all about it right now. So I think first and foremost, I'd like to ask you to start off with telling us a little bit about yourself. Where or what do you consider home, and how has it impacted who you are today?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a difficult question actually to answer because I'm born and raised in London, so that's what I would consider home because that's where that's what pangs feelings of nostalgia in me. But my family is originally from Sudan in East Africa, and so that's where we used to go every summer, and it was very influential for me. And also, we can talk a little bit more about it later, but how I ended up picking a career in science. It was very heavily influenced by summers spent in Sudan. And so I guess I would say it would probably be a mix of London and Sudan.
That's wonderful. That's so interesting. I suppose next maybe we'll get to hear about it, but how did you first fall in love with STEM?
So growing up, I think I was a little bit lucky because I had my mom's a dentist, so she was a scientist. She was also a dental researcher. And so didn't really practice clinically. She went straight into kind of researching dental biological mechanisms. But generally in my family, particularly on my dad's side, there were a lot of medics. So I grew up with science, being quite heavy in the household. And so I guess I would say that to some degree, I always kind of loved science, right? But I didn't pick it automatically because I wanted to be a little rebellious, and I was like, oh, this is what everyone here is doing. I don't want to do it. But I think for me, just as I went through high school, it just became clear that I really enjoyed the process of science, right? Like I enjoyed coming up with a question and then answering that question. I really enjoyed how specific it was. And actually, I originally thought I wanted to be a dentist. So that's what I started looking into, and ended up going into university and doing immunology instead and falling in love with it.
That's incredible. If you don't mind my asking, just out of pure curiosity, you mentioned that you were a little bit rebellious and maybe were like maybe not STEM during that period. What were some of the alternative things you were interested in?
Yeah, I considered law. So I did an internship with a friend's dad when I was 14 or 15. So I thought about law because I like to talk. And I also I like to talk, and at the time I was a very argumentative teenager. And so I was like, oh, this could be a very good option for me. So yeah, law was one thing I explored. And then other than that, I think there was a little spout of engineering as well, where I was like, but I guess that's also overlaps with science too. So it's not too far removed.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yes. And so, kind of hopping off of that, who are some inspirational figures who have influenced you along your journey?
Um, so I would say that to roll it back a little bit, while I was always interested in science, I always kind of had this idea that I wanted to be a well-rounded scientist. And like what I mean by that is that I didn't want to just do science. I wanted to bridge other kind of fields into it. And I think there were a couple of people who were very influential for that thinking. I mean, number one was probably my grandfather, who I'd never actually met. He died before I was born, but he was somebody who was also a dentist. He was actually also a dental researcher, and my mom, tried to follow in his footsteps. But he was incredibly interested in literature and would write a lot, and actually was doing psychoms, I would say, before that was even a thing. So grew up with like a library of a lot of his writing. He was someone who was interested also not just in dentistry but in anthropology and other specialties within science, and how having different viewpoints in general it's so okay. So the way that he kind of thought about his stance in science was the more kind of outside influences that you can bring in and the more additional skill sets outside of science that you can pull in, the more you can shape having a viewpoint that is out of what has been done before, if that makes sense. So, for example, the more that you read literature, the more it'll make you a better writer within science in the way that people may not have done it before you. And so that was something that I grew up always kind of thinking I wanted an expansive skill set. I didn't just want to stick to the sciences and math. And I think even when I was in high school, I really tried to remain like right before I went to university, I did one of my A levels was in Greek history and Greek civilization, just because I
Wow.
was interested in Greek myths.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I think in general, he was someone that was very impactful for the scientist that I think that I am today.
Definitely. That's so inspiring. It's always interesting to see how like people like separating like these silos of humanities and STEM, but in reality they feed into each other and it's really
Yeah.
important to be able to recognize that. That's fascinating. Next, I was wondering, so this I'm particularly interested because I'm at this point in my journey. I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on your undergraduate experience. What did you take away from your time at King's College London, and like how was it like essentially?
Yep. So when I started at King's, so originally I wanted to do dentistry, and to be very transparent, I had the offer, but I didn't get the grades. I missed it by a grade. And so at the time when I was trying to work out what my plan B was going to be, I was speaking to a lot of dentists, and a lot of them said that immunology was the hardest module that they had to do as part of dentistry. And so my rationale was, well, okay, if I start off doing immunology, then it'll make it easier when I eventually end up in dentistry. And so I entered immunology at King's with the intention of actually bridging over and transitioning at some point into the dental degree. And so when I started on the immunology course, I actually ended up falling in love with it. I think in general, I really liked how specific it was, like I mentioned. But in general, the course was taught really well. We got, the first year, I think, as in most universities, are way more broad. So you do chemistry, biochemistry, different modules, and then you kind of get more specific as the years go on. And so it wasn't until the final year of my undergraduate degree where I felt like the immunology teaching got really specific and it really honed in. And so a couple of things. I don't think that I took as much advantage of this as I wish that I could have. But one thing was that when I entered my third year of immunology, I selected lupus to do as my thesis, as my dissertation.
Mhm.
And I wrote just like a very short review dissertation on lupus in general, what it was as a disease, the biological mechanisms of it. And then at the end of that year, after I submitted, it was just complete coincidence that I saw a poster that this guy called David Eisenberg, who was the godfather of lupus at the time, was
Mhm.
supposed to come to King's and give a keynote speech. And so I signed up, I went to the talk. And while I was at that talk, I generally don't ask questions when the lecture theater is that big. You get the
Yeah.
shivers and the anxiety. So you're like, I'll leave it to postdocs and more established people to ask. But for some reason, I actually put my hand up and I asked him a question. And the question that I asked him was, why does this impact women more than men? It was quite basic. But at the end of his talk, he actually came up and gave me his card, and he was like, we're looking for a summer intern to address this exact question, the gender disparity in autoimmunity, and to understand what the impact of hormones, right?
Mhm.
And so ended up doing my internship that summer in his lab. And then there was a PhD open, and that's where I ended up doing the PhD. And so, in answer to your question, I think that the things that I learned the most about my undergraduate degree is that when you're doing your undergrad up until the very end, you're given access to people that you may never get access to once you leave, because you're being lectured by these incredible scientists and people with really, really cool viewpoints that are doing very cool work. And so I would say that if you are an undergraduate, to just really take as much advantage of that as possible, attend the events, attend the lectures, because even if you go and you realize that you're ruling out things that you don't want to do, it's still beneficial to you because it will help you decide what it is that you want to do as you move forward. So you might see someone and you say, oh, that's someone that I want to be in 10 years. And it helps you work out what you want to do next. Or again, you might attend something and you're like, I definitely don't want to do that. And I think that's something that I started learning in my undergrad.
Definitely. And I think it's so inspiring how just a single just like a single question that you had in this lecture like led to so many fantastic opportunities. That's honestly that's so inspiring. And okay, wow. Next I pardon me. Give me just a second. I suppose could you talk a little bit more about like how that internship went and how that shaped the next stage of your life?
Yeah, so honestly, I don't think that at the time I'd considered doing a PhD that early because I was raised a little bit kind of old school where it was the time where like you do a PhD after you've worked for a few years to specialize. It wasn't so much as this thing where like you do it fresh out of university, which is what I actually ended up doing. And so I wasn't really thinking long term. I did the internship over the summer and just really enjoyed the bench work. I enjoyed having a very specific topic that was mine. And then working closely with someone and kind of mirroring their experimental techniques to answer that question. And so when I saw the advertisement for the PhD position and Prof. Eisenberg and a couple of other people were like, you should apply to it, we think you'd be a good candidate. At the time, I still wasn't sure whether it was immunology, right? Because that's the thing with a PhD is that it locks you into a specialty. And so I wanted to be sure that this was the specialty that I wanted to lock myself into. So actually, while I was applying for the PhD, I also applied for a master's degree, which in the UK were at the time were only 1 year. And I ended up doing a master's in the immunology of infectious disease at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. The reason for that is because going to Sudan growing up, I did have like a passionate interest in infectious disease, and I'd had malaria 3 times by that point.
Oh,
And so
wow.
I was really interested in infectious disease, and a lot of people were saying to me, don't do research in infectious disease. There's no money in it. People don't fund infectious disease research, which is so interesting given where we are now, like
Yes.
10 years on. Um,
Surprise.
but a lot of people were saying, don't do it. Do autoimmunity, do allergies. Like rich people's kids get allergies, and then there's a lot of money and philanthropy that goes into this field. And so I did the master's in the immunology of infectious disease. I really enjoyed the master's, and I enjoyed the exposure to people who were doing public health, epidemiology, policy, all within the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. But I think that as the year went on, it kind of solidified in me that I wanted to do autoimmunity. There's just such a gap in understanding. And there was, a bigger gap back then where these diseases are unpredictable. No one really knows what triggers flares. No two patients look the same. They're a little tricky. So I just thought that by going into autoimmunity, it made a lot of sense to me. And so applied for the PhD, ended up getting an offer for the year for after I completed the master's. And so I completed the master's in September and then started the PhD October, so the month after, in lupus. And so I think the master's degree was very important to leading me into doing that PhD and really solidifying for me that this was the PhD that I wanted to do.
Definitely, over and over, a lot of the dialogue I hear surrounding whether or not should I do a PhD, should I not do the PhD, is that fear of being pigeonholed into studying a very specific niche thing, and so it's very interesting to hear how you use your master's to help inform that decision. I suppose could you summarize or talk a little bit about what the findings of your PhD thesis were, and how was the defense process like and leading up to it and all of that.
Yeah. So my PhD was interesting. I was very overwhelmed for the majority of it. I think I was lucky that like I tried to speak to a lot of people about the experience just to prepare myself. And there were lots of people who said, don't worry, you'll generate most of your data in the last year. And so they were like, most of the stuff that actually ends up making it into the thesis is stuff that you've generated towards the end, not the stuff at the beginning. And so that did make me feel a little bit better, but it was still, I think I was an anxious mess pretty much for the whole 3.5 years. It wasn't easy. I would say that a couple of things here. I don't even think that it was the work, but I think it was the emotional maturity. I mean, I started when I was 22, and I think that that's just young, like this, that's not an age where people typically, I know now it's pretty typical, but I think that it's more kind of being overwhelmed, the imposter syndrome, navigating the fact that you're always supposed to be working and generating data. I struggled with the fact that I stopped reading recreationally because I felt like if I had time to read, I should be reading a paper, not reading for fun. And so that was kind of my experience through it. I did enjoy the science, but it was hard. I felt a little isolated. But what my PhD was I got to, which I really did enjoy at the beginning of it, train as a phlebotomist. And so we got to do like a pretty intense course with the NHS in bleeding patients. And the reason for that was that there was a lupus clinic every Monday at UCL where I did the PhD. And because a lot of patients with lupus get bled a lot of them actually have collapsed veins. And so if you ask the nurses to take additional blood for you for your research, if they can't get the vein, they're not going to trouble the patient for it. And so the way that Prof. Eisenberg had it set up was that he would have us PhD students in a room bleeding the patients so that we could take their regular bloods for them in their regular tubes and send them to the labs. But then also once the needle was in, you'd say, do you mind if I get a little extra blood for my research, and then get them to consent on a form? Yeah. And so I enjoyed that part of it because it meant that you were actually in close quarters with the patients and you got to speak to them weekly and you could understand some of the things that, I wasn't just in the lab receiving blood and not really knowing who the face was behind the blood. You got to know the patients quite well because it was every Monday morning. And so my PhD was on two specific cell subsets. So it was B cells and NKT cells. And what we found was that, typically in immunology, particularly at the time, people were exploring protein interactions between cells. However, at that point, iNKT cells had been discovered, which are a type of cells which actually recognize lipids or fats. And so given that there was this other subset, so a subset of B cells that were able to interact with iNKT cells, we wanted to look at what that lipid interaction meant in lupus compared to healthy controls. And so the spoiler to it is that we found that there was a type of B cell and a type of iNKT cell that in healthy people interact really, really well and actually suppress the immune system and regulate the immune system really well. And in patients with lupus, that interaction doesn't work. And so that was it in a nutshell.
Definitely. Thank you. And I think I think that that's fascinating. And it's interesting that you were able to you know, not only learn about the science, but also learn about like navigating these conversations with all these different people to help contribute to your research.
I think also, one additional thing that I really value in hindsight was that it really was valuable to hear from the patients firsthand that like how unpredictable these diseases are, because I think that it made me kind of understand a little bit from a clinical perspective that we needed better, not just like digital apps, and like to address this question, you needed from all kind of perspectives, like telehealth, symptom tracking, everything needed to be in symphony for these patients, because it's exhausting for them to have to explain how kind of day to day, how different things are. And so when I moved to Boston to do my postdoc, I remember also thinking, I want to move to the US because biotech is better there. Symptom tracking and patients and apps in general are better there. And so the options for a patient with autoimmunity in the US are better than they were at the time in the UK and in Europe, because there were just companies like Patients Like Me, for example, in Boston, that had created a platform for patients to track what they were eating and what they were eating and their exercise and when flares were coming on. And so for me, as somebody who's getting blood at the bench, I was like, well, this is excellent if we can have that data to be able to like marry it with the lab data that we're seeing to see why on some days these patients have data that's off and on other days they don't. And so I think that's what it also shaped long term for me, which I appreciate.
Definitely. And you bridged the two concepts that I was just about to ask you about perfectly. I wanted to ask what motivated your decision to pursue a postdoc and come to the US. I know you already you already touched on that. But can you talk a little bit about your experiences with your postdoc in Boston? And yeah, that's pretty
Yeah.
much. Hmm.
So I think coming up to the end of my PhD, I wasn't sure whether I was going to stay in science. But again, I spoke to a lot of people who are older and wiser than me, and they said, if you're not sure whether you want to stay in science, do a postdoc, particularly if you've done a shorter European PhD, because it makes it easier for you to come back. If you ever choose, if you go to industry now and you ever want to come back to academia, it's easier to do if you have that postdoc under your belt as well. So that's what led me to the decision of, okay, I'm going to do a postdoc. I was also at that point sick of London. I mean, I think anyone who's done a PhD will tell you that sometimes by the time you get to the end of it, you're like, I need a new change. I need a change of face. I need a new apartment. I just need to move somewhere else because this is, it's a lot. So I wanted to live somewhere that spoke English to make my life easier, that wasn't the UK. And so the US just made the most amount of sense. And so I started interviewing in different labs in the US. And I actually was considering a lab in LA, and then saw the position open up at Boston Children's and Harvard Med School. And it was on a similar type of cell that I'd worked on. So it was also on regulatory cells, but more regulatory T cells. And this time this postdoc was on food allergies, which, to quickly explain it, if you think of the immune system as a balance, if you get an infection and your immune system fights that infection, that's great. But then once the infection's cleared, you need signals to send to your immune system to say that threat has gone now, come back to the middle. And so when the immune system doesn't get those signals, that's when you can get the push to the other side of the balance, where you start to get things where you get a break in tolerance. So a break in tolerance to things that you're supposed to tolerate, right? And so when you think of the worst of it, that's autoimmune disease, things like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. But actually allergies sit right here in the middle. So food allergies are when you have a break in tolerance just in the gut, or just in the airway would be asthma, or on the skin would be eczema. And something that really gets ignored commonly is that people that have autoimmune disorders also have like a lot of like atopic diseases. So like eczema, allergies, asthma. And so for me, that's why it kind of made sense. I was like, I did the PhD on autoimmunity. Let me look into allergies and understand the mechanisms of it locally. Exactly. And so the position came up. It was Tregs and food allergy. I can tell you the story of how I got the postdoc, actually, which is, it's a little silly. So I sent an email to the professor, Dale Umetsu, and I got an automated response saying, I'm currently in the UK at a conference. We'll get back to you in a couple of weeks. So then I sent him another email and I said, I know that you're at a conference, but I'm also in the UK and I would love the opportunity to interview with you while you're here. Can you let me know where you are and I can make it? And he responded actually, and he said, I'm in Liverpool for a conference, and Liverpool's about 3 hours from London. And he was like, can you meet me for lunch tomorrow? It's the only window that I have. And so the next morning I got a train at 6 a.m. and I went up to Liverpool. I got to the conference and the people at the conference wouldn't let me in because I had to pay the £500 registration fee or whatever. And so I left my wallet at the door and I said to them, look, I just want to go into interview. I'll leave all my things with you just as contingency, just like give me my laptop. I'll interview and I'll be back here in an hour and a half. And so that's how I interviewed with him. I went in, I interviewed with him. He was like, oh, I hope I didn't make you travel far. I was like, yeah, no, it wasn't a problem. And in my head,
No problem.
it was a problem. But no, I interviewed with him. And then a week later, he emailed me to say that I had the offer. So that's how, and then I moved a couple of months later.
I love that story. There's so many like little things, but I think that's actually a very romantic story. I think that's brilliant. Thank you. Um, yes, I wow. Um, I think next I'd like to talk about a little bit of the culture of the lab space and the work environment that you were in while you were doing your postdoc. I've heard a lot of people draw parallels between like the academic environment in like Boston, like in the Boston area when it comes to like labs and everything. I've heard a lot of parallels drawn between academic labs and like startup culture. And I
Mm.
was wondering, as somebody who's had experience in both realms, how do the environments compare, and does it measure up to each other?
Yep. So I will say that I ended up doing two postdocs actually because Dr. Umatsu actually ended up leaving after a year and a half. And so then I transitioned into another lab postdoc position in the lab next door.
Which lab
And
was
and
that?
that's So that was Talal Shatila's lab, which was what I ended up doing my actually 6-year jumbo postdoc. I did that in his lab. And I will tell you that it was ups and downs, right? Like in general, I mean, first day of leaving and then me having to work independently, then find another lab, and I was on a visa. But then even 6 years anywhere is actually a very long time. I mean, I was very happy with my postdoc in the end, and I got what I wanted out of it. But, there were ups and downs in terms of, seeing other people do 2-year postdocs and leave. And for me, it got to the stage where I got nice data, and it was clear that either I stay a few more years and I remain first author, or I'll have to back away if I leave earlier, and somebody else will finish the paper and they'll take it. And so I chose to actually just get the paper and do the time and then move into industry. I will tell you, just a side note, something for anybody who's considering a postdoc. I think the single most important thing is the mentorship that you have. So just like choose that wisely. If you have a mentor or a PI that's supportive, that has good communication, that stands up for you, because when it comes to things like authorship, it can be exhausting to over and over again have to fight your corner and have to argue about why you should go first. And so these are the types of questions to ask as you're applying for postdocs. I would say also make sure that you ask people that are in the lab, because people will be honest. Like when you're interviewing, ask them and say to them, take them to one side, the postdocs, the PhD students, what is this person like as a PI? Do you feel like they have your back when there's drama in the lab? Because inevitably there's going to be drama, because everybody's in the lab all the time. You're in close quarters. These aren't people that you've selected to be around all the time. And so there's going to be some butting of heads. And you want to make sure that you have mentorship in the lab that navigates those situations well. So I would say just make sure that as you're interviewing to ask those questions, because that is so important. It could make the difference between you deciding to leave completely science and pursue another route, and deciding to stay and having a really great career. But going back to your question, I think that it's in terms of industry versus academia, one of the main differences, just to get it out the way, is that in industry you get paid what you're worth, right? In industry, in academia you do not. And so that's one thing that can be quite difficult, is that you're like, why am I here? This is so difficult. I'm working long hours. I'm not getting paid as much as some of my peers who are in industry. But in terms of the culture itself, I would say that it's similar, that like mentorship is still important. It's still important to make sure that management and the leadership that you're selecting to work with are people who can navigate things like drama and the environment and the culture, because that's what's going to contribute to you being happy at work and you deciding to find another position. So that's where the similarities, I would say, are just, between the two. Those are the similarities.
Definitely, thank you. And I suppose you mentioned the importance of finding a good mentor and how crucial that is in order to like help establish yourself in STEM, or to keep going. And I wanted to ask you, what are some, obviously there's some obvious answers to what are some good traits of a mentor, but I suppose what is your advice for us when it comes to asking ourselves the question of, okay, is this person going to be a good mentor for me?
Yeah. So is your question more, what are the types of things to ask, or what are the types of things to look out for?
The latter.
Okay. So I think honestly, when you go to interview, pull the current people in the lab aside, reach out to previous people that have been in the lab or in the company, and just say to them honestly, just say, hi, I'm thinking of joining this lab. And by the way, most PIs are expecting that you're doing this. They're expecting that you're asking around about them, that it's a two-way process. Just send in a message on LinkedIn to anyone who was in the lab before or who worked with that person, and just say, hey, I'm considering a position here. I'm really excited. I just wanted to hear more about your experience. And I'm going to give you one example, actually. When I was thinking about which postdoc to go into, right, after Dale left, and there were two labs, one of which was Talal's lab. And I was thinking about which of these two labs I wanted to go into. I spoke to the postdocs, and they were very honest. Like, one of them said, you can go into this lab, right? Say we'll call it lab number 2, where you may not be worked as hard, right? You are not going to publish as high, but you'll have like a pleasant couple of years, right? And I spoke to postdocs in Talal's lab, and they were like, you're going to work really hard. It's going to be really long hours. You might have to come in on a Saturday, but you'll get the publication that you want out of it. And in my head, I was like, well, given that I don't know whether I want to stay in academia and I think I want the high publication, that's why I selected Talal's lab, right? And I was like, I know what I'm going into. So all to say that, like, having a conversation with people, even if people say something that might be perceived to be negative, if anything, it just allows you to walk into that experience with eyes wide open. So you know exactly what to expect and there are no surprises. So for me, when I selected Talal's lab, it wasn't a surprise to me when he was like, are you around on Saturday for a meeting? I was like, yeah, I knew that this was going to happen and I'm fine with it, you know?
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, so I think that those conversations are also important because they just, you know, help you prepare.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I think that that is definitely really important insight, and a lot of the upperclassmen here have also advised many of us to do a similar thing when it comes to asking about mentors, ask about former mentees, and see how they're doing. Definitely. I think next I want to pivot the conversation a little bit to talk about seed. To start out, what is it and how'd you get involved with it? I
Yeah.
remember when I first came across the page, I was like, this is so cool. And I knew you were involved with it in some capacity, and I was like, okay, this is actually how I first heard about you. And then I did a little bit more digging, and I saw that George Church was also involved with this, and I was like, this seems like such a stacked scientific team. I'm so interested. But yes, please tell us a little bit about Seed and how you got involved.
Yeah. So my postdoc project ended up being a microbiome project. It was kind of interesting because we had these animal models of food allergy, mouse models of food allergy that we were working with. And the postdoc before me noticed that when we moved the animals from one room to the other, the actual phenotype of the disease changed. And that's how, for us in the lab, there started to become like a connection between microbiome, food allergies, the environment, you know, which people had always suspected. That we're seeing an increase in diagnosis of food allergies because we're getting more sterile as a society.
Mhm.
And so the elimination of some microbes that we're used to seeing is leading our immune system to hyperactivate. And so my project started off as being a regulatory T cell in food allergy project. And then the microbiome story was just an incidental finding, but it was built on other labs that have also made the connection. So we weren't the first to kind of make that connection. And so a couple of years before the end of my postdoc, when I realized I want to move into industry, and I was talking to people and people were saying to me, do an MBA, you have to do an MBA or you have to do management consulting. And I was like, no, thank you to both of those options, because I think for me, my postdoc had been a means to an end for me for so many years. I mean, like 6 years is a long time, right, to be in one postdoc. And so
Absolutely.
I didn't want to go into another position where I was treating that as a means to an end. Like I wanted a job that I enjoyed. And so for the last 2 years of my postdoc, I actually started consulting for microbiome companies.
Mhm.
So we can talk about it if you're interested, but I reached out to companies. I started doing some consulting work to get experience. I worked for a food allergy company part-time, like gave them a few hours a week to kind of understand startup culture. But all of that kind of consulting work helped me work out what type of industry job I wanted. And I knew that I didn't want pharma yet. Like I didn't want a pharmaceutical bench position, which is the only position I'd be able to get with my experience. And I liked the analysis part of the science, but I didn't know whether I wanted to continue doing bench work. I wanted to be done with it. And so later stage companies weren't really as much of an option for me. And so in my head, I was like, I feel like I'm entrepreneurial. I might want to start something one day. So an early stage startup is the best option for me. So I started like shopping, looking at what early stage startups were coming around about in immunology and also in microbiome. And then actually a couple of people reached out and said, have you heard of this company Seed? It just launched. Another someone else was like, have you know, two people. And I was having brunch with a friend who also mentioned it. She was like, you really need to look up this company that just launched. They're doing microbiome. And I left, you know, on LinkedIn where it says, do you want people to see that you stalked them? I left that on pretty shamelessly.
Mhm.
And I stalked both of the co-founders on LinkedIn. And then I woke up the next morning and I had a message from Ara, who's one of the co-founders, saying, hey, like your specs actually look like a position that we're trying to recruit for. Are you free to jump on a call? So I spoke to her, I spoke to Raja, the other co-founder, and it just seemed like their viewpoints were very aligned with mine in terms of like they're looking that they want to make microbiome kind or micro derived products that have like actual functional data supporting them. So not just a probiotic that you get off the shelf, but something that could also be a therapeutic or used for different diseases or for the atopes. And so I started consulting for them. So I kind of stopped all of my other projects. I started giving them about 7 hours a week for 2 months. And during that time, worked out that actually we work well together and I liked the team and I enjoyed it. I told them that it was a deal breaker for me that I would not move to LA. I wanted to stay in the Northeast, which they seemed pretty okay with. And then they made me an offer. And so I finished the postdoc in October and started the position at Seed as director of research and development. And so what I was doing at Seed, I was the first full-time scientific hire. I was managing academic relationships. So I was recruiting scientific advisory. I was also searching IP, so working with tech transfer offices that had good microbiome IP, and then looking to see what actually, like what the field thinks of it, doing diligence, looking into the science, how feasible it is, how translatable it is. You know, is this a cool finding but can never actually be applied, or is this something worth the company licensing? And then I got to work with tech transfer and our legal team to license the IP. And then the coolest part, which I enjoyed, was also working with the formulations team to make the products. And then once the products are made, which I wasn't super involved in that process, it came back to me and I kind of oversaw partnerships where we would run experiments, both in vitro and in vivo, and also clinical trials to validate the products that had been made. And so I was kind of the person that was doing a lot of project management between all of these teams. Really enjoyed the position, learned so much from it. And it was, you know, it was a typical startup experience where you have to wear lots of different hats. And actually ended up moving to LA 2 months after I started the position. And so that's how much I enjoyed it.
That's incredible. So much so that it got you to move across the country.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
that and okay, that I think that is so interesting. And it's probably a pretty stark difference from I know you mentioned there's a lot of bootstrapping involved whenever we're working with any startup. And I suppose I will be hopping off of a question we have here in the chat. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your consulting work and some of the different projects you had to work on.
Yeah. So I the first company I worked with was I actually ended up actually, God, you just reminded me because I completely forgot. I worked with patients like me. So patients like me that I'd been keeping an eye on because of their like tracking of symptoms and tracking of patient data. I was at an event and Jamie Haywood, the CEO, was there. And I just like went up to him and I said, I think you're doing really cool work. And I was like, I have a PhD in lupus. And he was like, oh, that's cool. Like lupus is one of the diseases we're focused on. And we had a chat about it. And then, okay, so I'm going to jump here. So please tell me if you want me to expand
No
anywhere.
worries, we're ready to jump. Go for
Yeah,
it.
so at the time I was kind of tracking the people, like a lot of people, when I had reached out to my network and I said, guys, I'm interested in moving over into industry. If you know anyone in the food allergy or the microbiome space, please connect them with me. I'd be interested in speaking to them. I don't know what I want to do yet, just want to have a chat. And I spoke to someone who ended up being a mentor to me at the time. It was someone who was a venture capitalist who was like, let me know if you need any connections or any help with anything. And so after I met Jamie Haywood at this event, I added him on LinkedIn. And then that mentor said to me, why don't you ask him if you can be his apprentice? And I said, what does that mean? And he's like, I don't know. It just means that you get to shadow him, but then you can put it on your resume and you can learn more about the company. And so I linked in Jamie and I said to him, do you have 5 minutes for a coffee? He had about 20 minutes. And I went to Kendall Square. I grabbed a coffee with him. And then he was asking me what I wanted to do in terms of industry. I was asking for advice. And then at one point I just said to him, I'm just going to ask you, like, are you looking for an apprentice? And he was like, what does that mean? And I'm like, I don't know. That you'll let me sit in meetings and shadow you for a few hours a week, kind of like, yeah, literally just shadowing like you're in high school. And so that's how I started the process of consulting, where I would sit in on meetings with him for about 3 or 4 hours a week. I got to kind of see conceptually how he built products for patients like me. And it was just interesting for me to kind of sit there and just like observe how meetings happened. It was like very basic. I didn't really understand the technicalities of what they were discussing. It was quite basic, but that gave me some base knowledge. After the patients like me experience, I was connected with a food allergy company that had just launched in Boston. And so I spoke to the CEO of that company and I said, do you guys need any extra help? I calculated that with my postdoc, I would have about 7 hours a week available because even if I had lab work Mondays to Saturdays, I could get it done in a Sunday. So I said to him, I have about 7 hours available to consult for you. And so they would just throw me random tasks, like this paper on food allergies, translate it, our pitch deck for the company, make sure the science looks good. And so I did that for about a year and a little bit. And then I worked for a VC. So there was a venture capital fund that I was kind of interested in working for. I interviewed with them and I didn't get the position, but I did say to them, given that my expertise is in like this part of immunology, if you have any Treg companies and you want me to look over the diligence, I'm happy to help. And they actually took me up on that. And so like there were a couple of like companies they were thinking about investing in. And they said to me, can you just look over and just let us know what you think of it? And so it also kind of helped me establish myself in my head as an expert in specific things. And like, because, the stuff that you're doing in the lab is exactly what you're an expert in. And so that was something I was going to say to you earlier, that the thing about like the thinking that I also had about PhDs locking you into a specialty, that ignores the fact that just doing a PhD teaches you a set of skills, regardless of whatever that specialty is, that are insanely translatable once you leave the bench, because you know how to focus, you know how to be resourceful, because you have to be good at negative feedback because you get so much of that during lab work and your PhD. And so I would say, just for anyone listening who's just like wondering what they're getting out of their PhD, just like don't forget this like plethora of skill sets that you're also acquiring during it. And so all of that experience of consulting helps me build up my resume. I ended up attending a couple of very cool conferences. Like Google had like a biotech makers conference that I got to go to. It was like a workshop for 3 days, which looked very cool on my resume. And so all of that meant that when I applied for the position at Seed and they looked at my resume, I didn't look like someone who only had bench work. I looked like someone who'd also explored other positions outside of the bench.
Absolutely. I think that makes so much sense, and like what you were saying, you attain a lot of skills during that time when you're doing research, because one of the things that you have to constantly do for yourself is advocate for yourself, whether that's through like funding, like you were talking about authorship and the politics behind that. And being able to advocate yourself is such an important skill, especially like within the entrepreneurial realm where it's honestly just an entirely different world.
Yeah. I was going to say, but also, just the fact that you're digging into a technical expertise, whatever that expertise is, the fact that you understand that like the way things connect to each other, that things are nuanced and things are like, like your experiments are nuanced. There are lots of variables that can contribute to failure. Like these are all things that you actually learn when you do research, that if you don't do research, you actually never fully you don't, you, I think it's harder for you to fully understand that, just like how difficult and how multi-layered it can be to answer a question in science.
Absolutely. It's definitely very, very complicated. And I think there is like a big movement within like the field of, I know we've been talking primarily about VC, but also like a number of hedge funds have been picking up quite a few people with like stark scientific backgrounds, and also going to law school for IP later on down the line has also become increasingly popular amongst people pursuing STEM. So
Yeah.
like I mentioned at the beginning, that blending of the humanities and STEM is very characteristic of this next generation of the workforce, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I also think that kind of bridges over into science itself, because this is one thing I really liked about the field of the microbiome, is that for a really long time it was dominated by microbiologists, right? Who understood the microbes really well, but not necessarily like the disease or human disease or how it relates to like biology.
Mhm.
And then in the last 10 years, it's become clear that actually we need as many seats at the table as possible, right? Because the microbiome now has become this field where you have statisticians, microbiologists, immunologists, you have data analysts. Like it's so many people need a seat at the table to be able to navigate the data as it comes out. And it's really, really obvious when you look at the papers that are making it into high impact journals. It's the era of 3 authors on those papers is dead, right? Now you look at a paper that's high impact and it's got 15 people, yeah, like a list of authors, because you need multidisciplinary collaboration in order to make innovative findings and to like discover new things. And I think that, to your point as well, like bringing in the humanities is important as well. And I think that's something that I can't remember who it was who one of my mentors actually said this to me. It's if you ever have a problem, bring in as many different people from other disciplines, because you just never know, they might see things differently to the way that you're viewing them and help you kind of break through and come up with a solution. And so, yeah, I completely agree with you. I think this generation is kind of it's the era of like multidisciplinary collaboration.
Definitely. Everything is it's also probably a little bit more centered on like the I don't want to say art of business, but really the art or practice of business is the ability to make something like ideal into something like applicable and accessible to people. And so seeing that meld is super beneficial for the next generation.
Yeah.
Definitely. All right, I completely derailed from these questions. Um, but next up, I wanted to talk about the ongoing pandemic. So we brushed over it earlier with speaking a little bit about infectious diseases, but now I wanted to ask you, how has COVID-19 and the ongoing pandemic impacted your work?
Yeah. So um I was at Seed for about 2.5 years. And then I ended up transitioning over to be a scientific advisor because there was a company that I'd spoken to before, a cancer immunology company that I now work for. So I left Seed full time a year ago. And I think the pandemic had a lot to do with that, because during the pandemic, I started to really miss the immunology. Like, as we were discovering a brand new virus and the immunology of it in real time, I realized that actually, like, I love the microbiome, but I think that I like want to dig deep a little bit more into like and expand my immunology expertise in industry. And so I ended up joining a cancer immunology company that I'm at now called Orionis. The position that I have there is portfolio manager. It's not too dissimilar to what I was doing at Seed, but it's a later stage company. And so my job is to kind of due diligence on the different which cancers we're going to go after when, at which point. So I kind of sit between science and business. And the pandemic had a lot to do with that transition over. I mean, I could tell you the tangible ways that the pandemic also changed things. So at the beginning, about a few months into the pandemic, a friend of mine, I don't know if you've heard of this app Clubhouse, but
Of
so a few months
course.
into the pandemic, a friend of mine reached out and she was like, there's this new app Clubhouse, there's a lot of medical misinformation on it, would you be interested in joining? And at the time, I was home, as most of us were, I wasn't doing very much. And that's when I started using it, and I enjoyed using it because it was easy to produce content. Like when you think about Instagram or Twitter, like Twitter, you have to write out a thread. It's got to be witty and short and punchy. Instagram, you've got to use visuals. That takes time. But I enjoyed the fact that with Clubhouse, it was just Q&A. It was punchy. You can produce content quickly, and it was just my voice. And people, it was easier to debunk people when they were saying nonsense. Like it was just like, no, you're wrong. That's literally not how it works at all. And so I started using Clubhouse, and then I was on it for a few months, and then that's when things kind of picked back up at work, and then the world opened up a little bit more. We were spending less time at home, and so I wanted to continue the advocacy, mainly because I felt it, and I saw how important it was for my friends and family to have me and my sister, who's a physician, helping them navigate the COVID data and also the vaccine data as it was coming out. And then also, I think this newer generation's probably different, but like my generation was very like science stayed in the lab, like psychoms wasn't as much of a thing as it is now. And so I think just Clubhouse helped me see how important it was to continue that advocacy. And so using my voice to continue that advocacy. And so in January of last year, so about a year and a bit ago, when the vaccines were coming out, I just posted on my Instagram, if anyone has friends or family who want to do a totally private Zoom to talk through their anxieties about getting the vaccine, please let me know. And so I started doing about 6 hours a week of Zooms with strangers, just because, like, also for me, I just wanted us to be out of this thing. And I think that objectively, like, I can see as an immunologist that vaccination is the right thing, regardless of like the nuances that people want to talk about, it's the right thing for people to do this. And so it was just really interesting for me to like talk to people and see that like very basic understanding of like what a vaccine is, that wasn't something that was available to a lot of people, particularly Black and brown communities. I felt like there was a lot of like misinformation floating in that community. And obviously, being Black myself, like this was something that I felt very passionately about. And so I think the COVID pandemic just made me also realize, and then also the experience with Clubhouse, how important it is to continue reaching out to your community and like relaying the information that you're learning at the bench, and that the stuff it's not complicated. It's all about the way that you communicate it, and you can communicate it in a way that anyone can understand, and also in a way that can help people then make decisions for themselves and their health moving forward. I mean, obviously, if you're an expert, somebody isn't going to, in an hour completely understand a field or a specialty, but they can learn enough that can help them take it forward and move it forward with them, and be able to like understand why doctors, do certain things, why they don't do other things. And that helps build trust in healthcare and helps, it helps people survive. It can like save people's lives. Which with the pandemic, I think sadly was the question that was in the air. I mean, the difference with the vaccine was life or death for a lot of people.
Definitely. I think that's it's a really noble project. And I remember I was reading a couple articles written about your advocacy work and these conversations that you were having with people to help combat vaccine hesitancy. And one of the things that really struck me was your ability to validate these like validate concerns and then be able to explain the science. And I think what I wanted to ask you is, in navigating these conversations, what are some of the things that you discovered when talking to people who have views that are perhaps different from your own?
Yeah. So this is actually something that I would say I learned at Seed, because Seed really valued public scientific education. In fact, the customer service team pretty much, when I was there, they all had at least a master's in science. And so when customers would reach out, they would actually be able to explain the mechanism of like the products that we had, and also some of the science, like that, they would just be able to explain it in a way that, was palatable and also made sense. I learned a lot at Seed in terms of like psychoms, how important it is to be patient, and how important it is to always assume that a question is being asked in good faith, even if it's not being asked in good faith, to just make that assumption and respond accordingly. That's way more impactful. And I can give you one example. We would regularly get customers that would reach out very angry just for no reason. Like if you go to our Instagram page, sometimes there was like at the beginning of the pandemic, our marketing team put a photo of like trees, like it was like a trees in a forest, and it was like a bird's eye view of them, and the caption just said trees socially distance. So when a tree has a fungus or it has an infection, other trees actually will start to distance from it in order to not catch that thing. So there are like signals sent to other trees, and people were like, this is propaganda, you're pro COVID, like, and it had no, COVID wasn't even mentioned in the post. And so we would get a lot of very angry people on Instagram, or also just anytime you'd post anything science related, there was always, or vaccine related, people would just get very angry. But the marketing team were incredibly like good at responding to every single person. They would always make the effort to say, we want to understand more about your viewpoint. Why are you so upset? Blah, blah, blah. And then explain, we're simply writing this because XXX, but they would engage. And so through that process, I think I learned a lot. And so going into vaccine advocacy, there was a lot that I took out of the Seed experience, where it's important to be patient. It's really important. I mean, all of us everybody in this world is an expert in something, probably, right? Like there's something that they do repeatedly every day that they're good at, and other people are not. And we have technical expertise. When you have a PhD, it's just very clear to you what your technical expertise is. but like think of how many years it took for you to get fully comfortable in that knowledge. And so you have to be very, when you're trying to like communicate to the public, you have to remember that and think this is a lot of information. People have anxiety, they're bombarded, particularly during the pandemic. And so patience is key. So I would say lesson number one that I learned is that if I ever felt like I was starting to lose my cool, it's better to end the conversation because you're only going to cause more damage. Second of all, it's to ask questions. If someone's not listening to you, to ask more questions. Like, so for example, I've been in conversations where somebody was convinced that the vaccines had microchips in them. And so on Zoom, I did share screen. And then I said to them, can you tell me more about what the chip looks like? What's the size of the chip? Now, can you show me on Google an example of a chip that size? Because we used to microchip mice and I showed them and I was like, this is where we used to order them. And these are the sizes of the microchips that we used to order. Now, can you tell me how you'd fit that into a needle without somebody noticing? And then like, as you're asking them questions, they start to see through it themselves. Like they're like, oh, okay, fine, I guess so. Like, this doesn't make a lot of sense. The next question was then, well, I don't think it's a virus. I think it's a bacteria. And then I was like, well, wouldn't we use antibiotics if it was a bacteria? And then they're like, oh, I guess so. You know, like, so using, like working with the person, meeting them where they are, and then just asking them questions so that they can see the holes in their argument themselves, right? Instead of, which I guess sounds a little manipulative, but I guess it's more like guiding somebody and like also being open-minded to like in the conversation that it's a two-way conversation, not just you speaking at them.
Definitely. And there's nothing manipulative about being empathetic. It's just being strategic about
Yeah,
rhetoric.
yeah.
Yes. I thank you for explaining that. And I think one of the things that stuck with me from what you just said is the idea of once you start to lose your cool, you stop, you end the conversation because only negative things will ensue from there. And so, kind of in that vein, I was wondering, when it comes to the work life blend, what are some things you do outside of your very very busy schedule, in order to keep yourself in check? Do you have any hobbies, any fun things that you like to do?
Yeah. So I love people. I'm very social. So I like speak to my community. Like I, you know, my friends and my family, I lean on a lot, particularly during the pandemic. I was on FaceTime a lot. I was on FaceTime a lot. And so I like to keep connected with like friends and family. I read a lot, you know, I'm going to give you the typical I read, I listen to music. But I think one thing that I started doing during my PhD and I still continue to do is that I love reality TV because I feel it's one of the few times where I feel like it's just complete, my mind completely switches off and you're just like emotionally invested in strangers' lives for a reason. I have no idea why, but I'm just like so invested in these people's lives and I'm like tuning in every week. But yeah, I'm a big fan of any Real Housewife anywhere in the world. So like
I I completely understand. I just wrote an essay about the rhetoric of reality TV, specifically "Say Yes to the Dress." So I completely understand the appeal of reality television. I'm taking a class on American media right now.
that's
Um,
amazing.
and I think I remember you mentioned that you're a big reader, and just out of curiosity, have you ever read Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell?
I have not. I have not. I've heard of it, but I have not.
I highly recommend it because I think you would enjoy it greatly.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
I think at this point in time, I'm going to take a couple of the questions that have been sent in the chat, and I will go ahead and ask you. So I will start out with a question from Audrey, who unfortunately had to head out, but she'll be able to watch the recording to hear her answer. But she says, from what I understand about the microbiome, some diseases are correlated with gut dysbiosis, which has potential to be treated with microbiota targeted therapy. For seed, though, my understanding is that the pills are marketed as a daily probiotic. I was wondering, from a scientific standpoint, how do seed probiotics significantly affect people with normal gut microbiota?
Mhm. So the seed probiotics actually are not marketed for diseases. We I will say that like we were getting a lot of anecdotal feedback. So we one thing that we did not do is testimonials, but we were getting a lot of anecdotal feedback from customers with mild GI disorders, so things like irritable bowel syndrome, um, diverticulitis, things like this, that were saying that actually that's a little bit more aggressive than IBS, but IBS in particular, we were getting a lot of people reach out to say, I felt like I was getting better after I took seed. And so now we actually have a clinical trial at Bet Israel in Boston that's looking into whether seed can be used as treatment. But in general, the daily probiotic is for people who just need like daily augmentation. I mean, I know, particularly being a woman, sometimes with hormones throughout the month, things can go up and down and can be all over the place. And like taking a probiotic can kind of help smooth things out. I generally take probiotics when I travel because I can get funny travel gut. And so they can help just keep things regular. But in answer to that question, it's true that there are some diseases correlated with gut dysbiosis. However, not all diseases are driven by that dysbiosis. Sometimes it's not clear whether it's the chicken or the egg. And so seeds probiotic is not to be used as a treatment for any diseases.
Understood. Thank you. The next question is from Susie Lee, and she says, I volunteer at a community clinic which offers COVID vaccines. What is your advice for giving the COVID vaccines to patients with autoimmune, like overreactive immune system
Mm.
diseases?
So I'm going to start with the boring caveat of it's really important for people to talk to their doctors before, if they have an autoimmune disease, before they do anything or take anything. But in general, vaccines are recommended for people with autoimmune disorders because if you think about it, the comparison with vaccines in general is vaccine versus disease, right? So we're in the middle of a raging pandemic, and the purpose of a vaccine is to introduce one part of the virus itself. And so the rationale is, would I rather take my chances with a virus where it's not clear how I'll be exposed, when, to how much, at which point? Or do I get a vaccine that has the one protein the immune system remembers anyway, at a dose that's been modulated, that everyone else has taken, and it's done at a specific time? And so, given that that's the comparison, and the pandemic's raging and it's looking like a lot of people are getting infected, anyone with an autoimmune disorder, anyone even with cancer, it's a safer option for them to get the vaccine than to take their chances with the virus itself, which, as we know, can wreak havoc and cause way more long-term symptoms if you compare it to the vaccine.
Definitely. Thank you. And the third question we have here is from Michael. He says, Dr. Gadir, very inspiring talk. I think it is great that you have had the opportunity to interact with various patient populations. I'm in the healthcare field and deal with patients with autoimmune conditions like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, and I have to deal with the chronic pain. There are various pharmacological treatment options available, but do you have any general recommendations as it pertains to diet or supplements?
So this is a really good question. I mean, the thing in general is that, which is, this is, I'm going to say this is so boring, but like the immune system's complicated, right? I actually remember attending a conference a few years ago where the first speaker said, um, if there was, he was like, okay, so he was like, we need to abandon this thought that one thing causes disease, because if that was true, then like microbes would have worked out how to like kill us all a long time ago. The immune system is complicated, it's multi-layered for a reason. So there's never going to be one fix to any disease, right? It's always going to be targeting more than one mechanism, especially with complicated diseases like autoimmune conditions. So generally, when people ask me this question, I do say that like if you have an autoimmune disease, the best thing that you can do is actually start symptom tracking. Start day to day tracking your symptoms, what you're eating, and exercise, and how you exercise. There are a lot of very good apps that have easy like user experience that will allow you to track your day to day. And then while you're doing that, change your diet, play around with your diet, see whether switching maybe to plant-based, I know that works for some people, or switching to another diet, whether that impacts your symptoms and how it impacts. And then collecting that data will help you have a more personalized approach to what works for you. Because just generally, I think in life, what works for one person may not work for somebody else. And so I think like the best thing, if you are going to experiment with, diet or supplements after sign off from your physician, that you should just track your day to day as best you can to be able to see whether there are patterns that like correlate with less pain. I hope that's helpful.
It's definitely helpful. Thank you so much. At this point in time, I want to open up the floor to any additional questions people might have. Feel free to toss it in the chat. Oh, Michael says thank you. Or raise your hand if you would like to share your question yourself. Um, we'll probably take two more questions because I recognize we are running a little bit over time. We have a question from Catherine, who says, Dr. Gadir, thank you for this talk. I am not a professional, but would you mind talking about the difference between the COVID-19 vaccine and natural immunity, and which would be better in the long run?
Yeah. So first of all, to rewind a little bit, there's no such thing as unnatural immunity, right? Your immune system, the way that it responds to infectious disease is the way that it responds to infectious disease. And so I think one of the biggest misconceptions actually is that vaccines are like drugs or treatments, and they're not. So drugs or treatments, if you think about them, they're things that you take daily to augment your natural biology. So if you have diabetes, you take insulin in order to fool the body a little bit into thinking it's making its own, and you take it daily, or you take it repeatedly. But the way that vaccines work is different. It mimics what the actual virus does, but one part of it. So okay, so the way to explain this is that when your immune system, so when you get infected with something, when something goes up in your nose or your eyes or your mouth or through any opening in your body, your immune system, you have your innate immune system gets activated, and it starts immediately fighting, and it's non-specific, and it will attack that thing. And then if that thing is persisting, like what you get with SARS-CoV-2, then your innate immune system goes and activates the adaptive immune system, and it says to it, hey guys, this thing is in the body. Like the innate immune system literally grabs a chunk of the offender and it says, this thing is in the body and we can't get it out, start training. And then your body makes B cells and T cells that are specific to the thing that it's seeing in the lymph node. And then the B cells and T cells are released, and they come out and they nuke the field and they clean up. Okay. And so that's ideally what you want to happen with infectious disease. But the problem is that with infectious disease, it's unpredictable. If I catch it in a supermarket and somebody else catches it at home or catches it at a dinner, we're getting different dosages. We've got 28 plus proteins, or lots of proteins that our immune system is being bombarded by. And so what a vaccine is that it just has the spike in it, right? So the spike protein is the only part that your immune system is making B cells and T cells to anyway. And then that's in the vaccine. And so you get vaccinated, you make those spike specific responses. And then if you're exposed to the virus when you're out and about, you already have that army in your system that can give you a head start. It's not going to completely prevent the infection if you get bombarded, but it will definitely give you a head start, and your immune system will eventually win. And so in answer to your question, vaccines are always a safer option than the actual infection itself, because not just with SARS-CoV-2, but also with, if you think of other like polio, or you think of other microorganisms that can cause havoc, in order for you to get that immunity, you have to get hit with the right dose of it, that your innate immune system activates the adaptive. You also run the risk of getting really sick and potentially dying, which is a risk with a lot of other diseases, including this one, if you're vulnerable, or sometimes if you're not. And so that's the way to think about it, is that it's like, would I rather vaccine, or would I rather just take my chances out in the wild with this thing? And generally, my advice to friends and family and to myself is that vaccines are consistently always the safer option. So that's why doctors will always say, just get the vaccine, because vaccines are designed, they're easy to make because they're one aspect of the virus itself. And so anyway, I didn't want to make it today about COVID, but I'm happy to anytime if anyone else has questions.
Definitely. I believe I said we would do two more questions, and the second is actually by somebody within the Steminist Movement team. So Adeswa is the VP of Curriculum Development, and I'm gonna call her up. And Adeswa, you can go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hello, it's nice to
Hi.
meet you, and thank you so much for your talk for today. And I just want to ask about, in terms of the volunteer work that you're doing, and to talk about vaccine hesitancy. So there's been a lot of talk lately about like how many like communities of color, like Black and Brown communities, are really hesitant about like vaccines and like getting it because of different experiments like the Tuskegee experiment. And I was wondering, how do you navigate the misinformation that can sometimes be sent about these experiments that happen that sparks medical racism, but also empathize with the people that you're speaking to?
Mm-hmm. I think being honest that a lot of these topics have nuance. Like, for example, with Tuskegee, a couple of things here. They weren't given treatment, right? They were denied it. So it wasn't that they were given something that caused, like, meaning they weren't given a treatment that harmed these men. They were denied treatment. They were given a disease and they weren't given any treatment. So, like, highlighting that nuance, highlighting the nuance of the fact that everybody can tell you the name of the Black nurse that was involved in the Tuskegee research, but nobody can tell you the name of the white doctors that were responsible for the research in the first place. And so highlighting the nuance behind the way that that story is told is incredibly problematic to begin with, and actually is a little bit of an issue. But then also being honest with the fact that, like, healthcare is like any other system in this country is not immune to racism, right? It's absolutely not. And racism is a really big problem. And there's no clearer data than what we're seeing with COVID. I mean, 6 months into the pandemic, every single doctor that had died in the UK of COVID was Black or brown. And it's not because of biology. And people were doing mental gymnastics in labs, trying to come up with biological reasons or genetic reasons as to why the virus might be impacting Black and brown people. And there is none, right? The truth of the matter of it is that Black and brown people feel more pressure to, like, work longer hours. I mean, if you look at in the UK, this is a very specific situation within the NHS, that the reasons for it was that those doctors didn't feel like they could say no if they kept getting called up to service, whereas white doctors were more likely to set boundaries. When it comes to looking at the US in particular, I said, like, the Black and brown communities are getting hit harder, and that is because of racism, because, for example, their pain is believed less. That's data that we have. Essential workers are likely more Black and brown, and these are people that were being put at the front line of having to continue working while other people had the privilege of being at home. White communities had more access to healthcare than Black communities did, in terms of, you know, people who want to say build your own natural immunity by eating better, which is a little bit of a privileged take because we have food deserts. There are areas in the US where you have Black and brown communities who cannot get access to fruit and vegetables. And so all of this stuff together, I think being realistic about that, saying to people, yeah, you're right, there is a history there that is incredibly problematic. There are issues that continue to be problematic, but this isn't the one. Like, saying no to the vaccine is not what you should be doing. In fact, you're actually detrimenting yourself more by not doing it. Look at the people who are getting the vaccine, look at outcomes from the vaccine, and then having that conversation and working through the data, I found to be way more effective. And yeah, honestly, just being honest and, like, showing, like, because my viewpoint is what it is. And then I would just sit on these calls and I would say to people, like, I hear you and I see that viewpoint, but I'm just going to tell you a few things that I think that you might be misinterpreting a little bit, or you might not be fully understanding. And then we would talk it out. And yeah, I found that to be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Adesua. I think at this point, I want to thank you for your time and for this wonderful dialogue we've been able to keep. I'm so grateful that we were able to have this conversation. I've been a longtime fan, like I mentioned earlier, and so this has been an honor for me as well. So thank you for being our speaker for this Women's History Month talk, and thank you from everyone at the Steminist Movement.
Honestly, I'm so flattered that you listened to me. So thank you, everybody, for joining. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening. Good night, everyone.
Yeah. Take care.